You know what the most annoying thing about language is? Being able to understand people. Like, there's so many better uses for language, like, and, and even. So, here's my solution to this pesky problem.
Tyddochedidu pre duha saddo puhu huda tho robu thubrohi sapfachecha Zubvada dadu the zebhupu tebvahepide Chathochapuhu thopreputi.
To begin, I'll explain a bit further by what I mean by understandable, since that's a bit vague. My criteria for it is a language in which you can have a conversation with someone without someone else being able to eavesdrop on your private conversation. So in this language, there are 2 keys and 5 strands. Keys are things that are required to actually get the meaning out of certain strands, and strands are basically anything that can give information and are each relatively independent from each other. If you're confused, don't worry about it too much now. This is just some terminology, and you'll probably get it once I explain each one individually. Speaking of which, let's start with the keys. Both of the keys are used to unlock the main strand, which are the sounds coming out of your mouth. Obviously, if you want to be able to speak privately, publicly with someone, you'll both need to have the same keys, and make sure that nobody else has them. And presumably those keys are not pre-prepared, because you don't usually plan out which conversations you have in a day. The first key is a large number. How it works is that the main strand will be encoded using a Vigenère cipher, and the key will be, well, the key to decoding that cipher. To make sure that the encoded text is actually pronounceable, rather than encoding each sound, we encode each syllable. And while we're on the topic of phonetics, we might as well get those out of the way. The consonants are
P, B, T, D, T, Z, P, V, Th, Th, S, Z, F, V, Th, Th, H, G, P, B,
and the vowels are.
I, U, O, I, O, A.
And all the syllables are strictly consonant vowel. Now, we'll need a specific order to get every possible syllable in order to have a Vigenère cipher. And I'll get into that and generally more of the details in another video since time limit. And for now, let's just take a look at the order that they're in, or at least the first 20. Anyways, the way that you share the key is to publicly decide on a modulo and a base. You both raise the base to your own special exponent, mod it, then you exchange results, and raise your partner's result to your own exponent, and you should both end up with the same number. The second key is a sequence of numbers from 0 to 4. They represent which types of words will appear in a sentence in their order. The 5 different types of words in this language are verbs, nouns, grammatical words, adjectives/adverbs, and sentence conjoiners. Again, I'll probably have a separate video for more specifics. Either way, this means that we can get away with having up to 5 completely different meanings for one syllable. The way that the second key is communicated is eye positions. You might think that's a bit weird, but listen to this. If you need to talk in private, you might be someone like a spy, and spies are good at gathering information from tiny details like body language, and eye movements are a part of body language, so yeah, really makes you think, doesn't it? Either way, the way that you make sure you and your partners have the same key is kind of like the first key, except there's a whole bunch of different exponents this time, and you raise the power of, and the modulo is just stuck at 5. So now that we're finished with the keys, it's time for the strands. For the first strand, the first layer of defense against possible decoders is a simple Vigenère cipher. But that's not all. In theory, if we generate more text that is useless, then the decoding will take more effort than the encoding. So if we have more text, then it'll benefit the encoders more. This is where another concept comes in. We can make it so that almost any individual part of the text is meaningless, meaning you have to decipher the whole thing to get the actual phrase. So how do we actually go about doing this? We start with the verbs. One interesting thing about them is that they're actually constructed from several different actions, those being union, separate, contain, destroy, and equal. Those that make up a verb will be like an instruction manual for putting your sentence together. For example, the verb to speak is made up of the actions of separate, union, and contain. So you'd apply those actions onto the words in those sentence to get the actual sentence. After you have those actions, you'll finally get your sentence. But the issue is that all the words can have different meanings. So this is where you use your I key thing to disambiguate each word. But now we need grammatical cases, which are on a completely different strand. The reason for this is that applying inverted actions is pretty tedious, so it's more convenient to not add on extra syllables and have them separately. In this case, they're shown by the I's. Since we already got them warmed up for the I key, it'd be a waste not to use them again. Each type of word has exactly 5 different possible cases. For verbs, there are different conjugations, noun cases for nouns, differentiating between adverbs and adjectives, and superlative and comparative for adjectives. And for grammatical words and sentence conjoiners, they're just showing you different choices between two words you can combine together. You'll just use each I movement at the start of each word. Next, we'll talk about the next strand, which are tones. Later on, there's a system which makes it almost impossible to tell when a word is meant to start and the other word is meant to end, so we'll use tones to indicate that, as well as indicating where each verb is to make the verb encoding a bit easier. Now, small caveat. These are less of tones and more like a change in pitch. There are two tones, rising tone and falling tone. The rising makes you increase your pitch and keep it there, while the falling tone lets you reset your pitch to the original. The rising tone, if you haven't guessed, is used to indicate spaces in words, while the falling tone is used to indicate the verbs, but they aren't applied directly. When the two phrases are combined in verb decoding, specifically the actions of union or separation, the individual rising tone values have the XOR function applied to them. Meanwhile, the falling tone takes the key modulo the nearest prime number that is lower than the amount of syllables in the previous phrase, or just two, including the verb. And the result is how many syllables ahead of the verb it will go. The next trend is rhythm, the reason we need the tones to differentiate words. Rhythm is used to indicate verb mood, where there are 4 different possible rhythms. Each verb move is a different rhythm, and you add the I key converted from base 5 to base 10, then moduloed by 5. Finally, the last strand is punctuation, since there's not necessarily going to be a guarantee that you'll be able to add a natural pause to indicate something like a comma. There are 5 emotions which have harmony according to the consonant group that the verb starts with. Each emotion has 3 different actions, and each punctuation mark is represented by 2 different possible groupings of these actions. Okay, so this is the document where I did my actual translation. So to start with, I'll just go through what I did step by step. So this is large number key, or the key which you use the Vigenère cipher for. I'm sure you'll probably be able to find some group of numbers and modulo and stuff like that that can actually make that key there, but I just kind of made it up. And this is it just converted into actual numbers to make it easier for the Vigenère cipher, which, if you don't know, is just when you basically convert every number or syllable in this case into numbers, add them up with a key that repeats sometimes, and then just mod them by the total amount and then convert them back into their letter slash syllable form. So then this is the actual I key thing that determines what the words are going to be. To start with, I'm translating this phrase. So the first phrase, one rule is that you have to take the first 0 and move it to the start to guarantee that the first is a verb, because that's going to just make it generally easier to unlock the rest of the statement. I don't know whether that's the right term. So to start with, I basically just, this part's not really that hard to comprehend. The one concept that you need to know is the concept of, since these numbers are kind of representative of each individual word, sometimes you won't need like that many adjectives or that many nouns in a single sentence. So you're just kind of allowed to skip over them using this thing here, which basically says that those numbers, just consider them non-existent, just skip over them. And if you add another syllable to the end of it or more, then it basically tells you how many of those numbers to skip over in a row. So for this statement, it's basically just a simplified version. All it basically says is three things I certainly know, and then for the next statement, yeah, I just labeled the object thing, which is not very specific. Basically, what this means is that if you were to say something like, oh, I have an example here. I saw many things: crocodiles committing murders, birds eating eggs, and trees standing still. The things in question would be referring to verbs rather than if you saw a ball, a chair, a rectangular object, which would be referring to nouns. Well, sorry, these are referring to entire sentences rather than singular nouns. So then this one is for when you're specifying entire sentences. So then this one is also incredibly simplified, which just says he was a vampire. By the way, all the actual conjugations and noun cases are going to come back later. I'll get it later in the document. So then, next one, the next bastardization of this phrase is simplifying the sentence to a part of him wants my blood. And then, yeah, basically, same thing here. I guess I should go into more detail about how grammatical words work exactly, which is basically just any kind of word that can conjoin two other words together, or sometimes just one word in some cases. But either way, in this case, the grammatical word is showing that one noun is a division of another noun. An example would be like my hand or something. The final one was not very poetic, but it works. And I think this one's relatively straightforward. So then, this is where we start actually giving them their grammatical. To start with, I should go in and tell you what each of these accents here means. So two dots on the bottom would be zeroth case. One dot on the bottom would be first case. In case you couldn't tell, I do not know the proper terms for these things. Line on the top is second case. Dot on the top is third case, and then two dots on the top is fourth case. And then basically those all just show different possible cases for every individual kind of word. Let's go into examples. So for every single verb, which would be this one here, here, and I believe this one here, they all have the first case, which in verbs means that it is conjugated in the past tense. Meanwhile, this grammatical word here is actually interesting because I'm pretty sure that this is an adjective. All adjectives, they'll apply to the next verb to the right of them. But this grammatical word basically just decides that the adjective turns around and instead applies to the first verb to the left of it. And the accent here is showing that this grammatical word itself is applying to the next word to the right of it. This word means three, so it just applies to the next noun to the right of it. There's no grammatical word that changes its direction, so it stays like that. This one's just here to, that's one of the words that means skip over some part, or basically means nothing. And then this one means thing, and the thing is, I believe, the object of the sentence because I am the subject, so it's marked with this case or the first case, and the first case for nouns means that it's the object. Meanwhile, this one means I, and it is the zeroth case, and the zeroth case for nouns means that they're the subject. So then things like this basically continue throughout the rest of the sentence. Here's where the unfortunate things come in. So now we have to do the action things, prepare the sentence to be deconstructed or reconstructed by the verbs. So, for example, here. So, this verb here, it's comprised of the actions of equal and contain. So, that means that if you were to just see that in any sentence, then you go to the first two verbs, apply the equal action, which the equal action just means leave everything as is, and then the contain action, which is basically just very similar to the equal action, but deletes the second verb basically. But the thing here is that every time there's multiple actions in a row, instead of applying them both to the first verb, you apply them to the first sentence, second sentence, and then after that, the second one is applied to the third sentence and the fourth sentence. So then you can kind of get this chart from it. So as far as the actual verb action things go, this is actually a relatively easy case. So if you write out that 1 is equal to the first phrase, 2 is equal to second phrase, so on and so forth, you can just look at every individual action applied to each phrase. So this would be like from the perspective of someone who is hearing this and translating it. So like first they'd apply the equal action to the first two sentences they see, then they'd apply the containment action to the next two. Then this would be the next few actions since this verb is just equal. Then they just apply the equal action there, separate and contain to these few here. Then something to note here is that this one has multiple verb actions, union, union, contain. So since there's no more verbs after it, that means that they basically just don't get applied. 3 is split up into 3 parts, 3AA, 3AB, and 3B. So basically what happens is that 3A and 3B get conjoined together to produce 3A, then 3A, 3B gets separated in a way to produce just 3. How that works is that you need to encode the original 3 by something, preferably the same length. Then you should set the final product of the encoding to 3A, then set the actual key to 3B. And that's kind of the reverse for 4A and 4B. Yeah, so it's basically just a similar thing except with union. So you apply things in a bit of a different order, but like I'll get to it later. So you might be thinking, now that we know that we need to get a key to decode 3 by to get 3A, 3B, so on, what are we going to actually, how are we going to get the key? So basically, how you get the key is get a certain number, then take, and if that number is equal to like n, then take the nth prime. So like, for example, 382nd prime is 2633. So then after that, you take the square root of that, and now you have a theoretically infinite list of possible almost random numbers you can use. So make sure to also mod all of these by 160. So how did I get 382 basically? So there's a procedure where you count the amount of syllables in the current phrase, then multiply that with the current grammatical value, quote unquote, which is basically all the values of the grammar things added up, because why not? So for example, this one's equal to 1, this one's 2, this one's 3, this one's 0. So just add them all up, add 14 because sure, and then multiply that by the amount of syllables there. These are the numbers of the third statement here because the third statement's the separation one. Then you encode it by these numbers. You eventually manage to get something like this, and then the underlined ones, I do not think these are meant to be underlined, but these are meant to be the new underlined ones. I just could not be bothered to change the underlining. The thing is that you need to actually move the verb in the statement because the verb is actually not included in the actions. So like you just apply the actions around the verb. So you kind of just remove the letters that were meant to be with the verb in the phrase that doesn't have the real verb in it, then just put it in the other phrase. So like usually the first phrase keeps the verb. So you just, for example, change, I believe, these two into the verb, which is the Davy one, remove these two here. I don't think that any of that made sense, but sure. And then a similar process for the union, except this time we need to find two of them that, when combined together, create the original one. So what we can do is use the same square root method, but instead of adding it this time, we subtract it, which gives us two of the things that combine together to create the original one. That's how we get this. We apply the same thing with removing the verb and so on. Now we get to the tone slash pitches part of this. So what you do for this one is every single syllable gets its own unique number, which secretly is also the I number thing. You just give match every one of the I code thingamajigs with every syllable in there. Depending on whether it's even or odd, the following words tone only applying to the rising tones actually. If they're odd, they'll be a lie, and if they're even, they'll be a truth. And you might think that there's more evens than odds, so it's not exactly an equal split, but I think everybody appreciates honesty, so yeah, exactly. This is just it applied to everything. Then we'll talk about the falling tone in this one now, which is represented by these accents, which I will change into a more aesthetic version soon. How it works is, I think I already explained it beforehand, but we can go over it again. So convert the key here into a base 160 number. Every single syllable has a possible value from 0 to 160, and then you just interpret those as digits of a number, then convert it into base 10. So that's basically what happens. Then you take that key. This is the actual value of the key if converted from base 160 to base 10. Then what you do with it for this tone is that you mod it by the amount of syllables in the previous phrase, but not actually the amount of syllables, because it's the nearest prime that is lower than the amount of syllables in that phrase, because quirky, I guess. Then you mod it by that amount. For this one, I believe I got like 17 for this one. Counted back from the verb 17 places, and then place the following tone there. The same thing is applied for the rest of them. And small caveat here, I forgot to explain this earlier, but if there is no verb in the second statement, because it's kind of just might be like that to make things easier, then you just don't delete the second verb because it doesn't exist. Then I just marked all the other tones there. Now we have to do one final function, which is applying the Vigenère cipher, which is the main layer of defense. So after that, these are the results after applying the key to it. And then I just turned them, gave them the same spacing here, applied the same accents again. And then it's time for the final few things, which are rhythm and punctuation. So rhythm isn't too hard. Basically, all you do is take your base 10 number, then mod every individual digit by 4 to get a series of digits from 0 to 3. Then take whatever case you want, add it to that, and then take the mod again, obviously. So then that gives you your effective rhythms. And then 1 would be equal to an eighth note, 2 would be equal to a triplet, 3 would be equal to a dotted eighth note with a 16th note, and 0 is just equal to a regular quarter note. Finally, the last part to do before we are finished with this lovely translation is the punctuation. So we actually got pretty lucky with our rhythms in the fact that most of them ended exactly where the phrase itself ended. But in the case in which that doesn't happen, for example, I believe that happened here, you basically just repeat the first syllable until you finish out that rhythm. So in this case, there's only one syllable, so we just repeated that for the rest of them. As I said before, the punctuation is based off of what the first consonant of the verb is. So, for example, this one here is part of the anger consonant group. So then you choose the two anger options, the two anger actions of C and A. For another example, this consonant here is part of the boredom group. So you would choose the boredom actions of B and C. Another thing to keep in mind is that these actually get reassigned according to what the mod of the key is. But we got pretty lucky. When you mod the key by 6, it became 0, so we did not have to mix around the assignment for these. But in some cases, for example, all A's could become C's, or like all C's could become B's, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the translation. I'll probably play my friend's lovely recording of the translation. Unfortunately, my friend was busy for the final pronunciation, so you're gonna get me instead. Let's begin. Fertig vu d'après the thou vous di barre barbi fache Halsey the hoodie, lever beef to the sea, halsey hall, pavati fahifi, fe, fi, beauty paul, hop, fall, beef, pizzy, serve, the to baby, fi, fet, see, to party, zao, thu, su, that val, that,这一起飞，发猪猪猪。Thadzi betha thete duhi palpu vihithi titha hi fedza hupi thu bu zi thuti thu vi pi pe pfize pezite